In 1975, Ozzy Osbourne, the chaotic frontman of Black Sabbath, came face to face with the man who had shaped his very idea of what it meant to be a rock star. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. What should have been a moment of glory, a meeting of two legendary figures, instead became a revelation that shook Ozzy to his core. At the time, Ozzy was just 26, wild and untamed, living in the shadow of fame that Black Sabbath had brought him. The world was beginning to know him as the Prince of Darkness, but Ozzy still idolized the true king, Elvis. To him, Elvis was the epitome of everything he wanted to be: untouchable, powerful, and above it all. Meeting Elvis wasn't just a moment of admiration, it was the pinnacle of his rock and roll dreams. But when Ozzy finally stepped into the room with the king, what he saw wasn't the larger-than-life figure he had imagined. Instead, he found a man, once the brightest star in the universe, broken, tired, and haunted by the very fame that had built him. Elvis, the legend who had captivated the world with his charisma, was now drowning in a sea of isolation, self-doubt, and regret. The man who had once been the embodiment of youth and vitality was now a shell of his former self, struggling to keep up appearances. In that moment, Ozzy's perception of fame would be forever altered. What he had thought was the ultimate prize, the world's adoration, the wealth, the status, began to look more like a curse than a blessing. The truth about the price of stardom came crashing down on him. Fame wasn't the dream, it was a nightmare. Ozzy had arrived expecting to meet a king, but instead he encountered a man who had been consumed by the very fame he had once coveted. That meeting would become a pivotal moment in Ozzy's life, forcing him to face a terrifying question. Could he survive the same fate? The year was 1975. Ozzy Osbourne had already begun carving out his name in the annals of rock history as the chaotic, unpredictable frontman of Black Sabbath. The band, known for its dark, heavy sound, had become a force to be reckoned with in the music industry. Yet, despite the worldwide fame and growing fan base, Ozzy was still a young man, wrestling with personal insecurities, struggles, and doubts. By this time, Black Sabbath had already released their iconic albums that defined the very genre of heavy metal. But Ozzy was still grappling with the weight of fame. He was often drunk, high, and out of control, trapped in the whirlwind of the rock and roll lifestyle. His wild behavior was both a release and a coping mechanism, as he tried to escape from the pressures mounting around him. But none of it mattered when he was given the opportunity to meet Elvis Presley. For Ozzy, Elvis wasn't just another celebrity. He was the embodiment of what Ozzy longed for, the king of rock, an icon who could transcend the limitations of fame and become a living legend. Elvis had shattered boundaries and created a new era of music, shaping the cultural landscape. He was untouchable, larger than life, and to a young Ozzy, who still struggled with his place in the music world, meeting Elvis was the pinnacle. This wasn't just a celebrity encounter. This was an opportunity to meet the very man who had inspired his music and his ambition. But as Ozzy stepped into the hotel suite that fateful day, ready to meet the king, he quickly realized that the man before him was not the larger-than-life figure he had imagined. Elvis, dressed in his signature jumpsuit, still carried the aura of greatness, but there was a heaviness about him, something unspoken that hung in the air. He was no longer the vibrant force that had captivated millions in the 50s and 60s. Instead, he seemed weary, lost in his thoughts, his eyes clouded with something that was hard to pinpoint. Regret, perhaps? Loneliness? Ozzy couldn't tell. As they began to talk, Ozzy could sense the difference between the man who had shaped rock music and the man sitting before him now. There was a disconnect, a sadness that Ozzy couldn't ignore. This wasn't the Elvis that the world had adored, but a man in the throes of self-doubt, surrounded by an aura of quiet desperation. Elvis had once been the unstoppable force of rock, but now he seemed defeated, barely hanging on to his own identity. For a moment, Ozzy wondered if this was the real cost of fame. He had seen the press, the interviews, the concerts, but now, face to face with the king, he saw the toll that the fame, the isolation, and the pressure of being Elvis Presley had taken on the man. Elvis spoke of the toll his fame had taken on his relationships, his health, and his sense of self. He had the wealth, the adoration, the status, but what had it cost him? He confided in Ozzy about how he had been trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by people, yet always alone. This was a side of Elvis that no one had ever seen before. There were no cameras flashing, no adoring fans chanting his name, just a broken man trying to make sense of the life he had created. Ozzy, for the first time, realized that the image of the rock star that he had worshipped was just that, an image. And beneath that image was a person struggling to survive in a world where the stakes were too high to ever feel safe. The meeting with Elvis, however brief, made Ozzy start questioning everything. It was one thing to idolize a figure like Elvis, but it was another to see that even the greatest of legends were not immune to the damage fame could cause. In that room, Ozzy caught a glimpse of the truth, that the very thing he desired most in life could destroy him. It was a sobering moment, one that would stay with him long after the meeting ended. Ozzy Osbourne's heart raced as he approached the door of Elvis's hotel suite. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. This was the moment he had dreamed of for years, meeting his idol, the man who had defined rock and roll. To most fans, it would be a dream come true, but for Ozzy, the pressure was immense. Was he ready for this? What if he saw something in Elvis that shattered the image he had so carefully built in his mind? Could he handle the truth? As he entered the suite, Ozzy was immediately struck by the contrast between the grandeur of the room and the man sitting in front of him. The walls were adorned with expensive decor, the furnishings luxurious, but none of it could mask the sadness that seemed to permeate the space. Elvis, dressed in his rhinestone-covered jumpsuit, still looked like the king, but Ozzy could see it in his eyes, the weight of years of fame and the toll it had taken on him. For a few moments they exchanged pleasantries, but Ozzy could tell something was wrong. Elvis didn't seem to be fully present. His gaze was distant, almost as though his mind was miles away from the room they were in. It was disorienting, unsettling even. The man who had once captivated millions with his energy, his passion, now seemed to be a mere shell of himself, clinging to the remnants of the persona that had once made him the most famous man on the planet. Ozzy was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. He was still in awe of Elvis, but he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. He had always wanted to meet his hero, but now that the moment had arrived, it was nothing like he had imagined. The king wasn't glowing with the charisma Ozzy had seen on stage. He was faltering, almost as if the spotlight had burned him out. The magic was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that Ozzy had never expected. As the conversation unfolded, Ozzy learned more about the man behind the myth. Elvis spoke of the loneliness that came with fame, the sense of being trapped in an endless cycle of performances and public appearances, never truly able to escape the weight of the world's expectations. He shared stories of his failed relationships, his deteriorating health, and the emotional toll of being constantly in the public eye. For Ozzy, each word felt like a gut punch. He had always seen Elvis as untouchable, someone who had mastered the art of fame, a man whose life seemed to be everything Ozzy had ever wanted. But now, Ozzy was beginning to see that the very thing that made Elvis so extraordinary, his fame, was the same thing that had slowly destroyed him. There was a moment during the conversation when Elvis's demeanor shifted. His voice grew quieter, and his eyes seemed to glaze over as he spoke of the immense pressure he had faced throughout his career. Ozzy couldn't help but feel a deep sense of empathy for the man who had once seemed so invincible. What had happened to him? How had this become the reality of the King of Rock? Ozzy's thoughts were interrupted by Elvis's sudden change in tone. Elvis began to reflect on the fleeting nature of fame, the way it had seduced him into believing it could fill the emptiness inside, only to leave him with nothing but a hollow existence. Ozzy listened intently, his heart heavy with the realization that everything he had longed for, the fame, the power, the adoration, could just as easily turn to ashes in his own hands. The more Ozzy listened, the more he began to question his own path. Was he destined to follow the same tragic trajectory? Would fame consume him in the same way it had consumed Elvis? The tension in the room grew thick, and for the first time, Ozzy felt a gnawing fear deep within him, fear of losing himself to the very thing he had always dreamed of. By the time the meeting came to an end, Ozzy was no longer just a fan meeting his idol. He was a young man, staring into the abyss of fame, realizing that it wasn't as glamorous as it had seemed. The king was no longer a beacon of hope, but a warning, an example of what could happen when the price of fame becomes too high to pay. The weight of this realization settled on Ozzy's shoulders as he left the suite, his mind reeling with the knowledge that he had just glimpsed the truth behind the illusion. The turning point came when Elvis, almost unexpectedly, leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hush. Ozzy had been listening, still reeling from the emotional weight of their conversation, but now there was an undeniable shift in the air. The king, sitting before him, seemed to open up more than he had before. For a moment, Elvis wasn't just the legend. He was a man, raw and vulnerable, struggling with the crushing isolation that came with being at the top. "People think fame is the answer," Elvis muttered, his eyes distant. "They think itself fill the emptiness. But it doesn't sell it. It only makes it worse." Ozzy had been silent, trying to process the magnitude of what he was hearing, but this hit him like a punch to the gut. Elvis's confession wasn't just a passing remark. It was a life lesson, a revelation. As Elvis continued, his words were laced with a kind of bitter wisdom, a wisdom born of experience that no one could truly understand unless they had lived through it. "I had everything," he said, his voice almost trembling. "I had the fame, the money, the world at my feet. But what good is any of it if you're alone? What good is all the love from strangers when you can't even find peace with yourself?" Ozzy sat frozen, stunned by the weight of the words that spilled from Elvis's lips. For a moment, the noise of the outside world, the music, the crowds, the flashing cameras, disappeared. It was just Ozzy and Elvis, two men, one lost in a world of fame, and the other standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of which way to turn. Elvis's confession was more than just a warning to Ozzy. It was a mirror. For the first time, Ozzy realized that Elvis wasn't just talking about the dangers of fame. He was talking about the dangers of losing yourself. He was warning Ozzy about the dangers of trying to live up to a persona. As Ozzy looked at the man before him, he began to see the truth. Elvis had become a slave to the very thing he had once loved, the spotlight. But now, in the quiet of this hotel suite, Ozzy understood something deeper. Fame, he realized, wasn't about the adoration of millions. It wasn't about the glitz and glamour. It was about self-destruction. It was a slow and insidious thing that wore you down until you could barely recognize who you were anymore. In that moment, Ozzy felt a deep sense of fear and clarity all at once. He had always believed that fame would be the ultimate escape, the thing that would solve everything. But Elvis's words shattered that illusion. Ozzy had come to meet his idol, to bask in the light of greatness. But instead, he had been confronted with the very real truth that the cost of greatness was far higher than he had ever imagined. The king's words echoed in his mind as he left the suite. Fame wasn't the answer. It could destroy you. It could take everything you loved and turn it into ashes. As he walked down the hall, Ozzy's thoughts were jumbled, and yet there was a sense of resolve beginning to form within him. The man he had idolized was no longer the figure of invincibility he had once thought him to be. Elvis Presley had become a cautionary tale, a warning that Ozzy would carry with him for the rest of his life. Fame could lift you to the highest heights, but it could just as easily drag you to the deepest depths. For the first time, Ozzy saw clearly, it wasn't the world's love that mattered. It was the ability to love yourself in a world that constantly demanded more than you could give. The meeting with Elvis lingered in Ozzy's mind long after it ended. He couldn't shake the weight of the conversation. The raw vulnerability that Elvis had shown him, it was a side of the king that no one had ever seen before, and it felt like a window had been opened into a world Ozzy wasn't sure he was ready to face. Fame, once something he had longed for, now seemed like a heavy burden, a dangerous pursuit that could leave you lost, confused, and alone. In the weeks that followed, Ozzy found himself reflecting on his own life, on the reckless behaviors and the wild stunts he had performed in the name of rock and roll. He had always thought that fame would bring him everything he needed: validation, excitement, freedom. But as he remembered Elvis's words, a creeping doubt began to settle in his chest. Was he headed down the same path? Would he end up just like the man he had admired so deeply, broken by the very thing that had made him great? Ozzy began to pay closer attention to the choices he was making, both on stage and off. The wild parties, the drunken binges, the chaotic behavior, it all started to seem like a mask, something he hid behind to avoid confronting the emptiness he felt inside. He had always rebelled against authority, against expectations, but now, he realized, his rebellion had turned into a kind of self-sabotage. It wasn't freedom, it was destruction. There were moments in the following months when Ozzy would catch himself in the mirror, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, face pale from the excesses of the lifestyle he had chosen. He thought back to that conversation with Elvis, and a sinking feeling would wash over him. Could he really go down this road? Was this the cost of his own fame? The weight of Elvis's warnings became a constant presence in his mind, forcing him to face the possibility that he too might lose himself to the very thing he had once dreamed of. But it wasn't just a fear that Ozzy carried, it was a revelation, a moment of clarity that came from seeing the other side of the rock and roll dream. Fame might have given him everything he wanted in the external world: money, adoration, power. But it was clear that it could also take everything from him. The same loneliness, the same emptiness that Elvis had experienced, was now staring him in the face. Ozzy began to question if he had been so obsessed with the idea of fame that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. And then, just 2 years later, Elvis died, his life consumed by the very fame he had once sought. For Ozzy, the news hit hard. It wasn't just the death of a musical icon. It was the death of a man who had been a mirror to his own fears. Elvis's tragic end cemented everything Ozzy had learned that day in the hotel suite. Fame could lift you up, but it could also destroy you if you weren't careful. It was a harsh truth that Ozzy had now fully absorbed. Over time, Ozzy began to change. The recklessness that had once defined him began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. He started to take control of his life, not through fame, but through something deeper. He focused on the music, on the artistry, and on the people who truly mattered in his life. His wild behavior didn't disappear overnight, but the lessons from his meeting with Elvis began to shape the man he would become. And as Ozzy eventually embraced sobriety, it became clear that he had internalized the lesson from the king. Fame might have been his dream, but it couldn't be his prison. By breaking free from the self-destructive patterns of his youth, Ozzy found a new sense of clarity and purpose, one that was no longer dependent on the external validation of the world. The encounter with Elvis Presley may have been brief, but its impact was lifelong. It wasn't just about meeting a legend. It was about understanding the true cost of fame. Ozzy walked away that day with more than just a story to tell. He walked away with a new understanding of who he was, what mattered most, and how to avoid falling victim to the very thing that could have destroyed him. The meeting between Ozzy Osbourne and Elvis Presley was more than just a chance encounter between two rock legends. It was a powerful, life-altering moment that opened Ozzy's eyes to the harsh realities of fame, realities that, at the time, he had never considered. Elvis, once the king of rock, had become a tragic figure, burdened by the very fame that had made him a global icon. And in that hotel suite in 1975, Ozzy was confronted with a sobering truth. Fame could bring you to the top, but it could also destroy everything you held dear. For Ozzy, meeting Elvis wasn't just a brush with greatness. It was a wake-up call about the price of stardom. In that room, he saw firsthand how the pursuit of fame could leave you isolated, lonely, and lost. Elvis's confession about the emptiness that fame brought him made Ozzy question his own path and forced him to face the possibility that he too might end up consumed by the very thing he had longed for. But it was also a moment of clarity. Elvis's tragic end, just 2 years later, was a haunting reminder of what could happen when fame became your only identity. Ozzy realized that, while fame had its allure, it was not the answer to life's deeper questions. Fame could never fill the emptiness inside. Only self-awareness, love, and understanding could do that. The lesson Ozzy learned from Elvis would stay with him throughout his life, shaping his approach to fame and personal identity. While Ozzy would continue to live in the spotlight, he would also carry with him a profound understanding of what mattered most: the music, the people who cared about him, and the need to find peace with himself, away from the madness of the world around him. In the end, the meeting between Ozzy and Elvis was a moment that transcended rock and roll gossip. It wasn't just about meeting a legend. It was about understanding the true cost of greatness. It was a powerful reminder that while fame might elevate you to unimaginable heights, it could also tear you apart from the inside out. The legacy of Elvis Presley was not just in his music, but in the lessons he left behind. A reminder that the pursuit of fame without self-awareness can lead to self-destruction. So, what do you think? Did Ozzy learn from Elvis's tragic fall, or was it simply the meeting of two worlds that could never truly understand each other? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, be sure to share it with someone who might need a reminder of the true cost of fame. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real stories that shape the legends of our time.